I hope you're doing well. Today we have a new painting tutorial of this shimmery koi fish where we are using watercolors, foil paints and colored pencils together. If you don't own foil paints, however, no worries, you can easily skip that part and still paint the rest. I'm working in my B5 size watercolor sketchbook and we'll start today with a sketch that is probably the most important part of this painting. The shapes are quite clear and detailed, so it's much easier to have polished outlines before we start the coloring part. I decided to use this red pencil here that will match the coloring a little bit better than a regular pencil, but it's not necessary. This is also one of those paintings where you could easily change all the colors and create something totally different and unique, so just choose any colors that speak to you at the moment. I wanted the fish to take up most of the space here on this page, and it took a while for me to get the initial shape to be in the middle. I needed to erase and redraw quite a bit in this sketching phase, and I want to keep some of it in this video just so you guys know that erasing in the sketching phase is absolutely normal. It might affect the paper slightly if you erase a lot on the same spot, so it's always a good idea to keep your initial lines as light as possible and only darken the lines once you're sure about the overall shape. I think my koi fish here is maybe not the most biologically accurate. I guess that the tail and fins are a little bit bigger than in real life, but I wanted the overall look here to be very flowy and pretty, and I think that drawing these bigger help with that. But other than the tails and fins, a fish is a pretty simple animal to draw. The good thing is that the overall shape is pretty forgiving, which is why I think this could be a great drawing or painting idea for someone who is at the beginning stages of learning to draw or paint animals especially. But once I was done with the overall shape, I went over everything again to intensify the main outlines and to draw the scales. This step is pretty tedious and might require some erasing again, but keeping the shapes as even as possible from the first scale rows is gonna make it easier to keep the shapes even all throughout. My scales are also a bit uneven here and there, but that's something we can still fix a little bit in the coloring phase. But now that the sketch is finally out of the way, let's take out the watercolors and start with the first color layers. We'll start the coloring from the fins and tail, which will get this light pinkish orange color. I wanted the color here to have some variation, so I added a little bit more of the red shade on other parts and slightly more orange on others. You can also change the amount of paint and water you're using to keep the color a little bit more translucent in the middle of these shapes, and then concentrate the color a little bit more towards the tips or base. If you want to skip the colored pencil part at the end, you could focus a little bit more on this stage and add some extra shadows here and there. However, I was mostly focusing on these light background layers that will give us a nice base to work on, and then I'll add some further shadows later with a darker red pencil. But after the tail and fins were colored, I moved on to the body, and here we'll try to keep the shapes a little bit more concentrated. So I started to paint these red scale areas, and later we'll also paint a few with a darker black gray shade. I think this type of coloring is pretty common for koi fish, so it just makes it a little bit more recognizable, especially since the colors and the shape overall are maybe not the most accurate. I was trying to leave a small white gap between the scale shapes to keep the overall look a little bit cleaner, but if some of the shapes blend together, it's not that big of a deal. I also added just a little bit of coloring to the rest of the fish using the similar peachy pink colors we used in the fins, but we'll darken the rest of the scales and add some shadows later. So even though I felt like everything looked a little bit too light for now, I tried not to go overboard with the colors in the fish's body. But now we get to the fun part, which was adding the shimmery foil paints. I was recently gifted some of these foil paints that I really wanted to explore more, so this time I chose two colors from this fairy dual chrome set, and I also used some of these sparkly silver colors. So I started by mixing these two colors on my tiny test palette and started to apply this color to the tips of the fins and then dragging it down while adding more water to my brush, which helped to blend the shimmer slightly and keep the effect more minimal on these larger areas. I was having so much fun here and was just playing with these colors. The yellowy colors seem to be brighter, so I added more of that on the tips and then used the pink more for blending. I also added some of the silver colors on some of the shapes where I wanted the shimmery effect to be even more intense. I don't know if it helped, but at least it added such a pretty variation to the shimmer colors that shows especially on lower lighting when you turn the page around. It was really helpful that these shimmer colors were pretty close to the background color we used, because it really helped to blend these colors pretty effortlessly. I realized that I accidentally didn't record the tail part, which I'm very sorry about. My camera automatically turns off after 30 minutes and I didn't notice that, but I added these exact same colors and tried to sweep it along the tail to almost add these foil stripes that will clean up a bit in the next stage. But the last thing I did here with the foil paints was to add it to these scales with this teeny tiny brush, and I think it really helped to define these shapes, even though the foil effect is maybe not as strong here. But now we only have one step left for the fish part, which is intensifying all the outlines and details with colored pencils. As I mentioned earlier, this step could be done with darker watercolors, even gouache paints or markers, but I think colored pencils are a really easy way to add lines that require precision, and they are also pretty forgiving, allowing you to work slowly and without much pressure. I used this little bit darker crimson red pencil and then a black one to intensify some of the lines even further. So I drew some of these extra lines on the fins, going straight over the shimmery paints. I also used the red pencil to add some very light shadowing on some of the corners and edges of these shapes, and then I just did this all throughout the fish. I think this step really helped to separate all the shapes and add a final intensity that this picture definitely needed. But after this part, all there's left is to add something to the background. Again, this is something you could definitely skip, and I was considering it as well, but I thought this picture would look slightly more polished if there was at least something more going on. So I took out this big round brush and started by adding water all over the paper. I avoided adding any water to the fish so that the colors wouldn't smudge or blend together, and then I just started to sweep these light blue shades all over in this wet on wet technique. First, I wanted to create some sort of rectangle box to the background, but it didn't really work, so I gave up on that and painted a few swirly lines here. I also wanted to add a little bit more darkness under the fish to create this shadow almost. And then afterwards, when the paints had dried a bit, I added some white dots and lines using this white Uniposca marker. But that's finally all for this koi fish painting. I really hope you found it interesting and enjoyed following along. Let me know if there are any painting tutorials you'd like to see in the future. And if this was your first time around here, definitely consider subscribing for more. But I think that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a lovely day or night wherever you are. And I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye!